It was a calm evening, the air cool and filled with the subtle scent of earth and olive trees as Jesus and his disciples gathered beneath the large olive tree on the hillside. The day had been long. They had traveled many miles, encountering the crowds that hung on every word of Jesus. Yet even in the midst of his miracles, teachings, and the wonders they witnessed, the disciples still carried questions deep in their hearts. The sun was slowly sinking behind the hills, casting a warm amber glow over the landscape, and the world seemed to slow as the stars began to show themselves in the darkening sky. The disciples sat quietly, waiting, sensing that this was a moment of great significance. Jesus often took such moments to speak into their lives in ways that reached beyond the day's teachings, ways that touched the deepest parts of their being. Jesus looked around at his disciples, seeing the weariness not just in their bodies but in their hearts. He could feel their silent struggles, their doubts, the uncertainties they carried despite all they had seen and heard. Peter, always bold and passionate, often questioned his own worthiness, wondering whether he was truly capable of the calling placed on him. Thomas, the thoughtful one, wrestled with the questions of faith that lingered just beyond his understanding. And John, the disciple of love, though always compassionate, often felt lost in the enormity of the mission they were on. Jesus felt all of this not as a burden, but with the tenderness of a shepherd watching over his flock. He knew that what they needed was not more answers from the outside world, but a deeper understanding from within their own hearts. And so, with his soft yet compelling voice, he began to speak. "There was once a village," he said, his voice carrying with it the weight of the truth he was about to share. A small village nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains and deep, ancient forests. In this village lived a boy named Isaac. Isaac was known for his kindness, his curiosity, and his constant searching for answers. He had always been fascinated by the world around him, the sky, the rivers, the trees, and yet, as he grew older, he felt a restlessness inside him, a yearning for something he could not name. It was as if there was a hole in his heart that nothing in the village could fill. The disciples, who had been listening in silence, began to feel a resonance in the story. They too had felt that restlessness, that yearning for something deeper, something more. It was the same longing that had driven them to leave their former lives behind and follow Jesus. Isaac had heard stories, Jesus continued, from the elders in the village. They spoke of a treasure hidden far beyond the mountains, a treasure so great that whoever found it would gain wisdom, fulfillment, and peace. For as long as he could remember, Isaac had dreamed of finding this treasure. He believed that if he could just reach it, all his questions would be answered, and he would finally understand who he was meant to be. As Jesus spoke, Peter's heart stirred. He too had once believed that something outside himself would give him the answers he sought. For much of his life, he had chased after recognition, success, and validation, thinking that these things would prove his worth. And yet, the more he pursued them, the more he felt something was missing. Listening to Jesus, Peter realized that Isaac's journey was much like his own. One evening, Jesus said, as the village prepared for nightfall, Isaac sat with his grandmother by the fire. She was a wise woman, full of stories and wisdom that she had gathered over many years. She had watched Isaac grow, and she knew of the restlessness in his heart. Sensing that he was preparing to leave on his search for the treasure, she handed him an old lantern. It was a simple object with a cracked glass and worn metal, but it had a certain glow about it, a kind of quiet power. "Take this lantern with you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It has been passed down in our family for generations. Whenever you feel lost, light this lantern. It will guide you not to the treasure you seek, but to the truth you need to find." Isaac, though confused by her words, took the lantern, feeling its weight in his hands. He didn't fully understand how such a simple object could help him find the treasure, but he trusted his grandmother's wisdom, and so he took it with him. The disciples were drawn deeper into the story, imagining Isaac holding the lantern, his heart filled with both excitement and confusion. They could relate to that feeling, of being given something they didn't fully understand, yet trusting that it held the key to what they sought. The next morning, Jesus continued, Isaac set off on his journey. He walked for days, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains, his heart filled with hope. He crossed rivers that flowed fast and cold, climbed hills that seemed to stretch on forever, and walked through forests so thick that the sunlight barely reached the ground. But as the days turned into weeks, Isaac's journey became harder. The excitement he had felt at the beginning started to fade, replaced by exhaustion and doubt. The mountains loomed larger and more daunting with each step, and the treasure seemed farther away than ever. Every night as he made camp, Isaac would sit by the fire, staring at the lantern his grandmother had given him. He hadn't yet lit it, unsure of what it was supposed to show him. He still believed that the treasure was out there, somewhere beyond the mountains, and so he pressed on even as his doubts grew. At this, Thomas shifted uncomfortably. He knew the feeling well, the relentless pursuit of answers even when the path seemed unclear. He had often wondered whether his own search for understanding would ever be fulfilled, or whether he was chasing something he could never truly grasp. As the weeks passed, Jesus said, his voice full of compassion, Isaac's body grew tired and his spirit began to falter. He had climbed countless hills, crossed rivers, and wandered through endless forests, but there was still no sign of the treasure. He began to question whether the treasure even existed, or if it was just a story told to give hope to those who felt lost. One night, after a long and difficult day, Isaac sat alone at the edge of a dark forest. The stars above him twinkled faintly, but they offered little comfort. His heart was heavy with doubt, and for the first time he considered turning back. He felt lost, not just in the wilderness but in his own soul. The hope that had driven him forward was gone, replaced by a deep sadness and uncertainty. At these words, John felt a pang in his heart. He, too, had known what it was like to feel lost even while following Jesus. Despite his deep love and devotion, there were moments when the weight of the mission and the enormity of the path ahead left him feeling overwhelmed and unsure of his place in it all. In that moment of despair, Jesus said softly, Isaac remembered the lantern his grandmother had given him. His hands trembling, he pulled it from his bag and lit the candle inside. A soft, warm glow filled the darkness around him. As Isaac gazed into the light, something shifted within him. It was as if the light wasn't just illuminating the forest, it was illuminating his own heart. He realized in that quiet moment that the treasure he had been searching for was not out there beyond the mountains. The treasure was within him. The disciples listened intently, their hearts pounding as the truth of the story began to take root within them. The light of the lantern, Jesus continued, was a reflection of the light that had always been inside Isaac. His own soul, his own heart. He had spent so long searching for something outside of himself, believing that the treasure would be found in the distant lands, when all along, the real treasure was within him. Isaac wept, not out of sorrow but out of joy. He understood now that he was not lost. He had never been lost. The light had always been there, waiting for him to see it. Tears welled up in the eyes of some of the disciples as Jesus spoke. They, too, had spent so much of their lives searching for answers, for meaning, for purpose, believing that the truth lay somewhere outside of them. But now, as they listened to Jesus' words, they began to understand that the light they sought had always been within them, just waiting to be discovered. With a heart full of peace, Jesus said, Isaac stood up. He no longer felt the need to climb the mountain or search for the treasure in the far-off lands. He had found the greatest treasure of all, the light of his own soul. He returned to the village, his spirit lighter than it had ever been. Though he brought no gold or jewels, the people of the village could see the change in him. His face shone with a peace and wisdom that they had never seen before. His family welcomed him back with open arms, and his grandmother, seeing the light in his eyes, smiled. She had always known that Isaac would find his way, not by seeking something outside of himself, but by discovering the light within. Jesus paused, letting the silence settle over the group. The night had fully fallen now, and the stars above them shone brightly in the dark sky. The disciples sat in a quiet, reflective awe, the weight of the story pressing gently on their hearts. Then in the stillness Jesus spoke again, his voice filled with tenderness and love. "My dear friends," he said, "the greatest journey you will ever take is not to distant lands or to treasures hidden in the world. The greatest journey is the journey within. You may seek far and wide for answers, for meaning, for purpose, but the truth is, what you are seeking is already within you. You are the light. Just as Isaac's lantern guided him back to himself, so too will the light within you guide you to the truth of who you are." The disciples were overcome with emotion. Peter, unable to hold back any longer, stood up, his voice shaking with the weight of his own journey. "Lord," he said, "I've spent so much time trying to prove myself, trying to find my worth in the things of this world. I've searched for answers everywhere, but I never thought to look within." Jesus smiled at Peter, his eyes full of compassion. "Peter," he said softly, "you are more than enough. The light that shines within you is a gift from God, and it is the very thing that will guide you. Trust it, for it will never lead you astray." Thomas too felt moved by the story. He had spent so much of his life questioning, doubting, seeking answers that seemed always just out of reach. But now, as he listened to Jesus, he realized that the answers he had been searching for were not beyond him. They were within him. "Lord," Thomas said quietly, "I've always thought that if I could just understand everything, if I could just find the right answers, then I would have peace. But maybe the peace I seek isn't in the answers, it's in trusting the light within me." Jesus nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "Thomas," he said, "your questions are not a burden, they are a gift. But do not let your search for answers blind you to the light that is already within you. You do not need to understand everything to find peace. The light within you is enough." John, whose heart had always been full of love, felt tears welling up in his eyes. He had followed Jesus from the beginning, his love for him unwavering, but there were moments when he too had felt lost in the enormity of the mission, lost in the weight of what lay ahead. But now, as he listened to Jesus' words, he realized that the love he carried in his heart was the very light that would guide him. "Lord," John said, his voice filled with emotion, "I've always felt that love was my purpose, but sometimes I feel so small, so insignificant in the face of everything you've called us to do. How can my love be enough?" Jesus looked at John with deep affection. "John," he said, "the love you carry in your heart is the greatest gift of all. It is the light that will shine through the darkness, the light that will guide not only you but those around you. Never doubt the power of that love, it is more than enough." The disciples sat in silence for a long time, each of them reflecting on the story and the truth that Jesus had revealed to them. They realized that they had spent so much of their lives searching for something outside of themselves, whether it was answers, validation, or purpose, when the truth had been within them all along. They were not lost, they had never been lost. They had simply been on a journey to discover the light within. As they sat together under the stars, a sense of peace settled over them. It was a peace that came not from understanding everything or having all the answers, but from knowing that the light within them was enough. And in that sacred moment, they knew that the greatest treasure they could ever find was not something they needed to search for. It was already within them, waiting to be discovered. The stars twinkled brightly overhead, and the disciples felt the warmth of the truth that Jesus had shared with them. They were no longer searching, they had found the treasure. They had found themselves. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.